Chapter 1. The Mysterious Letter. It was a crisp, quiet Tuesday morning in St. Mary Mead when a letter arrived, pulling Miss Jane Marple toward the heart of a perplexing mystery. The postman had come earlier than usual, and Miss Marple, settled in her routine of knitting and sipping tea, only just noticed the white envelope on her small wooden table. Its official seal from St. David's Village Police was unmistakable. With a soft sigh, she set her knitting aside and lifted the letter, its smooth paper hinting its serious business. Curiosity stirred within her. St. David's was a place she'd visited only a handful of times, but her years in St. Mary Mead had taught her that even the quaintest villages hid intricate webs of secrets. She opened the envelope with her usual measured care and read the neatly typed words, "Dear Miss Marple, we hope this letter finds you well. We write to request your assistance in a grave matter. A brutal and troubling case has shaken St. David's, the murder of a young girl, Ann Summers. The circumstances of her death have left our community reeling, and we are at a loss. Your invaluable insight would be greatly appreciated in solving this case. Yours sincerely, Inspector Godfrey." St. David's Police. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly. Murder, even in the sleepiest of villages, had a way of stirring the hidden currents of human nature. Though St. David's was unfamiliar, the prospect of unraveling its story intrigued her. She knew, as always, that the truth would lie not in bold acts, but in the quiet details others overlooked. Rising from her chair, she smoothed her cardigan and placed the letter on the table. St. Mary Mead had been her home for decades, but the pull of a new mystery was irresistible. With a decisive nod, she fetched her coat from the hallway cupboard, her mind already sifting through the letter's words. St. David's was a short train ride away, and soon she stepped off the platform into the village. A cool breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and flowers, a reminder of the rural charm that drew city folk to such places. Yet today, a heavy mood clung to St. David's like a fog. The village was hushed, broken only by the soft murmurs of townsfolk, their whispers trailing past her as they exchanged guarded glances. The scene outside the station was eerily calm, a stark contrast to the dread that Miss Marple could feel simmering in the air. The villagers, as she passed them, avoided eye contact, their faces drawn in sorrow. She had been to enough villages to know that when tragedy struck, it left its imprint on the very streets. By the time she arrived at the village square, she was met by a tall man in a dark suite figure who stood out from the otherwise ordinary townsfolk. He was pacing back and forth near the town, looking quite out of place in his serious demeanor. "Miss Marple, I presume," he said, with a slight bow, his voice filled with relief. "I'm Inspector Godfrey, St. David's Police. I'm so glad you could come." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, her tone as composed as ever, though her mind was already turning over the details in Thelator. "I understand you've had a rather troubling case." "Troubling is an understatement, I'm afraid," Godfrey said, his face etched with concern. "A young girl named Ann Summers has been found murdered brutally, so her body was discovered near Thornfield Cottage, just on the outskirts of the village. She had been attacked, and her hands and feet were broken. It's a dreadful thing to have happened here. This sort of thing doesn't belong in a place like St. David's." "I could see how it would be a shock to everyone," Miss Marple murmured, her tone thoughtful as she surveyed the village. "The suddenness of it, the cruelty of people who have lived peacefully for years are the ones most affected by such feelings." "Exactly," Godfrey agreed, nodding gravely, "and we don't know where to start. We've interviewed a few villagers, but no one seems to have any useful information. She was well liked, it seems, and there were no indications that she had enemies." Miss Marple stood still for a moment, taking in the scene. The village, though picturesque, was now shrouded in an undeniable heaviness. Asif, the murder, had cast a long shadow over every familiar corner. She could sense the underlying tension in the air, I'm sure. "You've already spoken to the girl's family?" Miss Marple inquired, her eyes sharp as she turned to the inspector. "Yes, we've spoken to her parents. They're devastated, of course, but they can't shed any light on who might have done this. That's why we've turned to you, Miss Marple. We're in need of some men who can read people, who can see what's hidden beneath the surface." "I'll be glad to help," Miss Marple said. "Perhaps if I meet with them, we might find something that hasn't been considered yet." Godfrey nodded, clearly relieved. "I'll take you there now. It's just down the road," as they made their way through the village. Miss Marple couldn't help but reflect on the nature of small-town tragedies. People often thought that such places were free from malice or intrigue, but Miss Marple knew better. It was always the quiet ones, the ones whose lives appeared most ordinary, held the deepest secrets, and she was certain that Summer's death had its roots buried in the fabric of this peaceful village, just waiting to be unearthed. With every step, the mystery seemed to grow more intricate, and Miss Marple was more than ready to begin peeling back the layers. Chapter 2. Kind-Hearted Girl. The Summers family home sat on the edge of St. David's village. Modest, beautiful, inviting, nestled behind a well-kept hedge and a row of cheerful flower pots. The front garden was a patchwork of neat borders, and there was a calmness to the house that spoke of lives led by routine and quiet respectability. As Miss Marple approached the small, cottage-like dwelling, she couldn't help but appreciate how fitting it was for the family it housed. A family of simple but steadfast character. When Mrs. Summers opened the door, there was no mistaking. Deep sorrow etched into her features, a small woman, her hair dusted with silver. Mrs. Summers' face was pale with grief, yet, as she welcomed Miss Marple into the house, there was a certain dignity in her manner. She led the way into a cozy sitting room where a fire was flickering softly in the hearth. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old books, and despite the sorrowful occasion, it exuded a warmth that made it clear this was a home that had been loved and cared for. "Please, Miss Marple, do sit down." Mrs. Summers said, her voice wavering slightly as she gestured toward a chair by the fire. "We're so grateful that you've come. We know you'll help us find the answers." Miss Marple, with her usual grace, accepted the invitation, settling herself comfortably into the armchair. Her sharp eyes swept the room, noting the framed photographs on the walls, most of them showing a young girl with a bright smile, her features so like her parents that there was no doubt she was their pride, enjoyed the absence. Avon Summers, who had once filled this space with her presence, was palpably ill. "Do what I can," Miss Marple said, gently, her voice soft but carrying a weight of experience that could not be ignored. "I'm sure there's much we can learn from those who knew her best." Mr. Summers entered the room at that moment, tall, stoic man with a weary expression. His face was drawn, and his eyes betrayed sleepless nights he had no doubt endured since the tragic discovery of his daughter's death. His gait was slowed, his shoulders stooped under the burden of grief, but he was composed nonetheless, the type of man who bore his troubles in silence. He, too, welcomed Miss Marple, though there was no denying the sickness that hung heavy in the air between them. "We've been trying to make sense of it all." Mr. Summers sat, lowering himself into the chair opposite Miss Marple. His voice was thick with sorrow, and he dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief. But there was something in the way he spoke that Miss Marple found revealing a subtle undercurrent of vexity. "You must be terribly upset, Miss," Marple said quietly, her eyes kind but knowing. "Such a loss is never easy to bear." Mrs. Summers nodded, her voice trembling. "Anne was such a sweet girl. Everyone loved her. She worked at the shop, in the village every morning, and then in the evenings she tutored children, adored her students. She was always so eager to help them, and they loved her in return. We were so proud of her beauties. I never thought something like this could happen to her. The village must be in shock," Miss Marple remarked, her eyes narrowing slightly as she observed Miss's reaction. There was something in the way she had spoken, something offhanded about the description of Van's work, but Miss Marple said nothing of it just yet. She was a good girl, Murmurs added, his voice steady despite the pain that clearly lingered beneath the surface. She had everything ahead of her. Her future seemed so bright. She was engaged, once you know. Miss Marple's interest piqued, and she leaned forward slightly engaged. "You say?" "Yes," Mr. Summers contended, his expression darkening to a man named Robert Langley. He was from a nearby village, a charming young man, at least he seemed to be, but it all ended badly. Anne was heartbroken. She discovered that Robert had been married before, and when she found out he didn't tell her the truth, it was a dreadful shock to her, and the engagement was broken off. Mrs. Summers sniffed, dabbing her eyes once more with her handkerchief. She took it hard. She was always so trusting, so open-hearted, and for him to deceive her like that, well, it was too much for her. Her Miss Marple observed the couple carefully. There was no doubt in her mind that Anne's heart had indeed been broken by Albert Langley's deception, but she couldn't help but wonder, was there more to the story, than they were revealing? Was there any bitterness in Anne's heart for the man who had betrayed her? The details were vague, and Miss Marple's mind began to work, spinning out the potential threads that could lead to the truth. "Do you happen to have Albert's address?" Miss Marple asked gently, her tone casual but keen. "I believe it might be important to speak with him. Perhaps there is more that can be learned from him about Anne's state of mind in theaters leading up to her death." Mrs. Summers rose from her chair and retrieved a small slip of paper from the mantelpiece. She handed it to Miss Marple with a slight tremble in her hands. "Here it is, but I can't imagine how Robert could be involved in all of this. He's been gone for several days now, and he seemed so upset when they broke up. He couldn't have had anything to do with it." Miss Marple accepted the paper with acquiescent nod. She could sense the deep hope in Mrs. Summers's words that the man who had hurt their daughter might not be connected to this gruesome crime. Yet Miss Marple was not so easily convinced. She had learned over the years that the simplest explanations were often the most elusive. "You never know, Mrs. Summers," Miss Marple said softly, rising from her seat. "Sometimes the answers we seek are hidden in plain sight. I will speak with Albert and see what he has to say. But in the meantime, I treat to rest. You've been through much." As she turned to leave Miss Marple felt a subtle weight in the air, an intuition that this was only the beginning of a far more complex mystery. Anne's death was certain had a deeper story to tell, and she would uncover it one piece at a time. Chapter 3. A Man on the Run. The afternoon sun hung low over St. David's as Miss Marple and Inspector Godfrey made their way down the winding lane that led to Albert Langley's cottage. The village seemed oddly still, the only soundbite distant twittering of birds and the faint rustle of leaves in the soft breeze. It was the kind of day that suggested nothing could possibly be amiss. Yet Miss Marple's keen senses were alert to the undercurrent of tension that lingered in the air. Albert Langley's cottage, though modest, was perched at the edge of a small copse of trees, a place where one could enjoy a quiet life away from the busy center of St. David's. Ivy that crawled up its stone walls was neat but unmistakably aged, giving the cottage picturesque quality. However, there was no warmth in its appearance today, only the cold, stark reality of its recent emptiness. They were met at the door by the landlady, a small elderly woman with thick spectacles perched precariously on the end of her nose. Her hair, gray and wispy, framed her face like a cloud, and her voice, when she spoke, had a nervous tremor. "You're looking for Mr. Langley?" she asked, peering up at them with wide eyes, as if she had not quite believed their arrival. "He's not Hiroshi. Left 3 days ago. Just like that." She snapped her fingers, the sound small but final left. Miss Marple inquired gently, her tone suggesting that she had already noticed the disarray of the cottage, the absence of the usual signs of a well-kept home. "Was it sudden then?" The landau nodded. "I sudden enough, not a word to me Jess. Packed his things, and when I'd not have thought it of him quiet. Polite young man, always paid his rent on time, didn't make any trouble, but then, all at once, he was gone." "Did he say where he was going, Inspector?" Godfrey asked, his voice a little sharper than usual. The woman shook her head. "No, not a word, not to me anyway. And no, he didn't leave any note or anything. He just vanished." She seemed to take a small comfort in this, as if her explanation was adequate. But Miss Marble's mind was already turning over the possibilities. Could he have been angry about the broken engagement, Miss Marple asked Skew thoughtfully, her gaze fixed on the empty cottage, as though looking for clues hidden in plain sight. Inspector Godfrey frowned, looking between the two women. "It's possible, Miss Marple. But there's more to it, isn't there? People don't just vanish without reason, especially not after something like that. And there's no sign of any other foul play here." "No, senor," Miss Marple agreed, though her voice was calm and unhurried. "But the timing does make one think, doesn't it? A man betrayed in love, leaving without a word. It's not as simple as it seems." Landau shuffled her feet, clearly uncomfortable with the subject of Robert's disappearance. She glanced nervously at the door behind her, as though expecting him to come bounding through it at any moment, explaining away his sudden departure. But Miss Marple's mind was already elsewhere, focusing on the subtle details she had observed, the way the small things seemed out of place, as though Robert had not just left, but had been pulled away by something urgent, something he could not share. "Do you have any idea where he might have gone, Miss Marple?" Presagingly, her tone more soothing now, as though coaxing the truth from the landwill to be the easiest thing in the world. The landwill hesitated, Kia, hands fluttering around her apron. "I don't know, miss. I really don't. He kept to himself mostly, but there was something. Just before he left, he did get a letter. I didn't see it, mind you, but I did notice him reading it in a hurry. One morning, it wasn't long after that, he started packing." Miss Marple's sharp eyes flicked. "To the inspector a letter," she said softly. "Interesting. If we could find that letter, it might shed some light on why he left so suddenly." Inspector Godfrey nodded, although he was clearly skeptical. "You think it's that simple?" "Nothing is ever quite as simple as it seems, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm, yet firm, the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "But that letter may hold the answers we need with no other leads to follow." At that moment, the inspector turned back to the landlady. "You find anything? Anything at all that might help us, don't hesitate to contact me," he said, his voice gentle but insistent. As they left the cottage, Miss Marple's mind was busy with the pieces she had collected. Robert Langley's sudden departure, 3 days after his engagement to when summers ended, was too much of a coincidence to ignore the broken engagement. The mysterious letter, the absence of any explanation, it all pointed to something more heartbreak. But what was Robert hiding, and why had he left with urgency? "Do you think he's guilty, Miss Marple?" Inspector Godfrey asked, his voice low, as they walked back to the village. Miss Marple's gaze was distant, focused on the path ahead, her mind already turning the case over like a jigsaw puzzle. "I don't know, Inspector, but I suspect Robert Langley's story isn't as simple as it appears." The inspector gave her a glance, but Miss Marple merely smiled knowingly. Her steps slow and measured. She had a feeling that the answers lay not in what had been said, but in what had been left unsaid, things only a careful observer could uncover. And Miss Marple as always, was more than ready to begin her work chapter. For the shopkeeper's tale, the small shop on the corner of St. David's Village was as neat and tidy as the village itself, its shelves stocked with an assortment of goods that suggested a long history of loyal customers and careful management, the kind of shop where till people came not just for their daily needs, but to exchange the latest bits of gossip, or perhaps to share the small but important moments of village life. Miss Marple stood just outside the window, taking in the humble exterior, the sign reading, "Arrows General Goods," swinging gently in the breeze. As she entered, the bell above the door chimed a soft greeting, and she was met by a man in his mid-40s with thinning hair and a ruddy complexion. Mr. Hargrove, the shopkeeper, looked up with a start, and though his greeting was polite, his eyes betrayed a deep unease. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," said his voice strained. I wasn't expecting company, not today." He smiled, but the effort seemed forced. His hands were fidgeting nervously with the edge of his apron. Ash wiped his palms. "Mr. Hargrove, I'm afraid it's a difficult matter that brings me here," Miss Marple began, her voice warm but direct. "I'm investigating the tragic death of Aunt Summers, and I understand she worked here. I was hoping you might be able to help me understand more about her life." "Here, Anne," he said with a wistful smile, though it quickly faded. She was a good worker, that one, always on time, never a complaint, took pride in everything she did. "A real gem, if you ask me, miss." Marple noted the shopkeeper's evident fondness for the young woman. He spoke of her with a sincerity that spoke volumes about his character and work ethic. However, tension in his voice suggested there was more he had yet to reveal. Miss Marple waited, allowing the silence to ostrich just long enough to encourage him to continue. "Did Anne have any troubles during her time working here?" Marple asked, her tone gentle but piercing. Hargrove hesitated, his eyes darting to the back of the shop before he seemed to make up his mind. "There was a young man, Robert Finch. He worked here before Anne, you see, but well, I had to let him go, miss." Marple's sharp eyes Methusent. Why was that he was caught stealing? Anne was the one who spotted him right before. "I did. She told me about it, and I had no choice but to dismiss him on the spot." Miss Marple could telltale the memory of that moment still troubled Mr. Hargrove. He shifted uneasily, and she could sense that something about this incident was not as straightforward as it seemed. She leaned in slightly, her voice soft but commanding. "And how did Finch take to being caught, Mr. Hart?" Grove's face darkened, his hands now gripping the edge of the counter. "He was angry, Miss Marple, very angry. I'd never seen him so furious. He threatened her, said he'd get revenge, of course. I thought he was just mouthing off in the heat of the moment. People say things when they're embarrassed, don't they? I didn't take it seriously at the time." "Did Anne seem worried about it?" Miss Marple pressed. "No, Grove replied quickly. "She wasn't one to worry much about such things. Quite a strong girl, Anne. She just got on with her work and didn't let it bother her. But now," he trailed off, his gaze unfocussedly disturbed by the turn of events that had led to Anne's untimely death. Miss Marple absorbed this information quietly, her mind working rapidly. The idea of revenge was not new to her. It was a motive that had appeared in many a case she had investigated over the years, but she could not shake the feeling that something else was at play here. Something deeper than mere anger. A sense of unease settled in her chest as she watched the shopkeeper. "Do you happen to have Mr. Finch's address?" she asked, her voice steady but firm, as though she were asking for a simple, ordinary piece of information. Hargrove hesitated. I'm not sure. I don't usually keep such details, but..." He went to the back of the shop, rifling through a drawer, and returned with a piece of paper. "Here it is. Finch's address. He's renting a small room on Maple Lane, just outside the village, miss." Marple took the slip of paper, her fingers brushing think to dress. "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove. I appreciate your help. If you remember anything else, anything at all, please don't hesitate to contact me." The shopkeeper nodded, though his expression was one of uncertainty. "I do hope you find the answers, Miss Marple. This whole thing has shaken the village to its core. I just wish I'd done more. Perhaps seen the signs earlier, miss." But Marple's eyes softened with understanding, but there was a sharpness to her gaze that suggested her mind was already moving for it, sifting through the puzzle pieces with precision. She smiled faintly. "Sometimes, Mr. Harav, the signs are not as obvious as we'd like them to be, but the truth is always there waiting to be uncovered." With that, she turned and walked out of the shop, her mind already considering Robert Finch's role in the unfolding drama, the threat of revenge at sudden disappearance of a young man who had been dismissed for theft. These were not small details. Miss Marple knew that in the quiet corners of St. David's key to solving Anne's murder was hidden in plain sight, and she would find it just as she always did. As the door closed behind her, the village of St. David's seemed to breathe a little heavier, the weight of its secrets pressing closer to the surface. Chapter 5. A Thief's Secret. The morning had brought with it a crisp breeze, carrying with its scent of damp earth and fresh beginnings, a stark contrast to the grim task that lay before Miss Marple as she walked down the cobbled path leading to Robert Finch's cottage. The village of St. David's seemed to stand still in the wake of the tragedy that had occurred days before. The usual hum of life in Apesville village had been replaced with a solemn hush, as if the very air was holding its breath. Robert Finch's cottage, small, its stone facade softened by ivy that clung to it like the secrets of its occupant. The door was ajar, and as Miss Marple knocked lightly, she could hear the faint clink of china inside, as if someone were preparing tea. The constable, who had been assigned to the case, greeted her at the door, his expression professional but tinged with concern. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "I regret to inform you that Trabert Finch is not in any condition to speak. He's had an accident, quite a nasty fall. He's been taken to the hospital." "It's an accident, you say?" Miss Marple inquired, raising an eyebrow. "How curious, and how severe?" "I'm afraid," the constable replied. "He fell from a ladder while working at his cottage, broke his leg badly enough that he'll be out of action for some time. I'm certain, however, that it has no connection to the case. He's been nothing but cooperative since we began our inquiry, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's been a bit distracted by his own misfortunes." Miss Marple studied the constable's face for a moment before nodding. "I see. Well, I shall have to follow this lead later, but for now, I suppose I must turn my attention elsewhere." The constable agreed, and Miss Marple made her way to the next destination. Lucy Mayfield's house sat at the far end of the village, its garden neatly trimmed and the flower beds bursting with color, despite the heavy cloud that seemed to have settled over the village in recent days. As Miss Marple approached, the door opened before she could knock, and a woman who could only be Lucy's mother stood before her. Mrs. Mayfield's face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red, and though she had a composed manner, there was a palpable heaviness in the air as she welcomed Miss Marple inside. "I'm so sorry to trouble you, Mrs. Mayfield," Miss Marple said with her usual gentleness, "but I need to ask a few questions regarding your daughter's lessons within Summers. It may be the key to understanding the tragic events surrounding her death." Mrs. Mayfield nodded, her face hardening slightly. "I understand, Miss Marple. It's been a dreadful time for us all. You need not worry about me. Please ask your questions." The house was as neat as one could expect for a family who had recently experienced such loss. The sitting room, though modest, was warm and inviting. Mrs. Mayfield gestured at a word. An armchair, and Miss Marple sat down. her gaze flicking momentarily to the windowsill where, small vase of flowers sat. The vibrant colors seemed out of place in the otherwise somber atmosphere. Understand that in told Lucy regularly. Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but probing. Can you tell me how Lucy reacted to Anne's death? Mrs. Mayfield sighed deeply. Lucy adored Annethe, were closer than I realize, I think, but since Anne's passing, she's been distant, not herself at all. Shapaused, then added in a hushed tone, Lucy was often in the garden at the back of his house after her lessons with Anne. She said she liked the fresh air, you see, but lately she's been too withdrawn, Tatuk. About it, she never once mentioned anything unusual. Miss Marple's eyes flickered towards the back of the house where a small path led to a garden that bordered the woods. I see, and you said she's been more withdrawn lately. Yes, Mrs. Mayfield replied, her voice shaking slightly. She seemed afraid of something. She wouldn't say what I thought it might have been the news about Anne's death, but now I wonder her words trailed off as if she were lost in thought. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Ange stood, her eyes focused on the garden beyond. Mrs. Mayfield could. I take a look at the garden. It may offer us some answers. The garden was small, but well maintained, with a neatly trimmed lawn and a few flower beds that seemed to overflow with color at the far end. Out of the garden, a stone well stood, its iron cover slightly askew. Mrs. Mayfield, noticing Miss Marple's gaze, seemed to stiffen. I'm afraid the well has been a source of some distress, Mrs. Mayfield said quietly. Lucy was always drawn to it. I never thought much of it, but she seen Meadow spend hours there on some days, staring into the depths. Miss Marple's heart quickened. It. Could you show me, Mrs. Mayfield? With a soft nod, Mrs. Mayfield led her to the well. As they approached, Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the ground, noting a few disturbed patches of earth around the base. It wasn't until they reached the well that Mrs. Mayfield's compass opened to crack. She motioned to the opening. I've been too afraid to look myself, Mrs. Mayfield whispered, but Lucy, we found her. She was in the well. The words struck Miss Marple like a physical blow. Though she kept her composure, the police had already removed the body, but the grim discovery had turned the entire village upside down. Lucy is dead, Miss Marple asked softly, though she already knew the answer. Yes, Mrs. Mayfield replied, her voice breaking. She's been strangled. Miss Marple, we don't understand why. Miss Marple's mind began to churn with possibilities. The death of Anne Summers, so violent and mysterious, now seemed linked to the death of Lucy. Both girls had been in close contact, yet the connection between them remained elusive. But Miss Marple was certain that the well, the mysterious mark on Lucy's soul, held the key. Something had frightened the girl, and Miss Marple would find out what it was. I believe, Miss Marple murmured more to herself than to Mrs. Mayfield, that we are uncovering something far darker than we could have imagined. Chapter 6. A startling revelation. The village of St. Davidson's, the epitome of pastoral calm, now seemed cloaked in an unsettling silence. Marple's thoughts were far from her usual musings on village matters as she made her way down the gravel path leading to the Mayfield household. The tragic loss of young Lucy, whose life had been cut short so violently, had left an indelible mark on the village. Now, as Miss Marple approached the house, she could feel the weight of grief that hung over it. Even from a distance, Mayfield, the girl's mother, was a frail woman, her features softened by sorrow and fatigue. She greeted Miss Marple with a quiet nod, her eyes red from weeping, though she seemed determined to carry on in the face of such unspeakable tragedy. Her hands, though still delicate, were steady as she opened the door, wide, ushering the detective into the dimly lit hallway of their modest cottage. I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you're here, Miss Marple, Mrs. Mayfield said, her voice barely above a whisper as if speaking too loudly might chatter, the fragile peace that had settled over the house since Lucy's death. I don't know where to turn, the shack of it. Oh, Lucy, my poor darling, she was everything to us. Miss Marple offered a sympathetic smile, but said nothing, letting the words settle into the space between them. She had seen in our grief in her time to know that sometimes silence spoke more clearly than any words could. We were just so close to getting some answers, Mrs. Mayfield continued, her voice breaking slightly. And then Simon, he's taken it so hard, Miss Marple. He's been withdrawn, not himself. And then, just this morning, he came to me with his face all scratched up. Miss Marple's attention sharpened at the mention of Simon. Mrs. Mayfield only said the boy had always been a quiet presence around the village, a sensitive and thoughtful child, though he had never been particularly outgoing. But now Miss Marple's gaze flickered to the stairs that led up to the second floor, her mind already piecing together a puzzle that had yet to reveal its full shape. Semina's upstairs? Miss Marple asked softly, her voice almost a murmur. Yes, Miss Mayfield replied, glancing anxiously toward the staircase. He won't speak to anyone about what happened, but he seemed so different this morning, more withdrawn than I've ever seen him. I'm not sure what to think. He barely ate, hardly said a word, only told me he wanted to be alone. Miss Marple nodded in understanding, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. The scratches fresh on the boy's face, how they tugged at the edges of a mystery. She was beginning to unroll something in Simon's behavior, and his quiet distress had caught her attention. I would like to speak with Simon, Miss Marple said gently, thought firmness in her tone. Porked, no argument perhaps. He will open up to me in time. Mrs. Mayfield hesitated, her gaze flickering uneasily. I don't know if he will, Miss Marple. He's in such a state. Miss Marple's expression softened, but there was an undeniable steel beneath her gentleness. Sometimes people need someone to listen, someone who won't judge them. You believe I may be able to help? Simon found his way back from this grief with a reluctant nod. Mrs. Mayfield stepped as a bellowing Miss Marple to ascend the stairs. The air in the upstairs corridor was heavy, and the quiet that it descended upon the house seemed almost oppressive. At the end of the hallway, Simon's bedroom door stood ajar. Miss Marple knocked lightly before stepping in her presence. Quiet and unassuming, Morin Mayfield sat at the edge of his bed, his eyes downcast, his face pale. His clothes, though clean, were wrinkled, and his tousled hair seemed to reflect the chaos of his thoughts. As Miss Marple entered the room, he looked up, his face a mask of confusion and sorrow. His gaze flickered over her briefly before returning to the floor, his expression clouded with a mixture of guilt and despair. Simon, Miss Marple began softly. You is very concerned about you. Says you've been in great distress since Lucy's death. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, but he didn't speak. Miss Marple, ever patient, took a step closer, her voice gentle, but with an inch of firmness. Simon, I understand that you may feel overwhelmed, but sometimes when we keep things inside, they can become much more difficult to bear. You're not alone in this. You can trust me, and if there's anything you need to say, I listen. For a long moment, there was silence between them. Simon's fingers switched nervously, and Miss Marple could see the weight of something dark, sitting heavily on his heart. Then finally, his voice broke the silence, his words tumbling out. A rush, I did it. Simon whispered, his voice barely audible. I killed them both. Miss Marple's eyes widened, only slightly, but her composure remained unwavering. What do you mean, Simon? Who did you kill? Simon's eyes, wide with fear and guilt, flicked up to meet hers. Anne and Lucy. I killed them both. His confession came in a torrent, as if the floodgates had finally opened. Hikes plained how, in a moment of fury and confusion, he had taken the life of both girls. Anne who had rejected him, and Lucy, who had witnessed his crime. His face waist-twisted with remorse as he spoke, and his hands shook uncontrollably. I never meant for it to go this far, Simon continued, his voice cracking. But when Lucy saw me, I couldn't let her tell anyone. She wouldn't keep quiet. I had to stop her, and she never loved Melick. I loved her. I thought if I could just make her see me, but then I lost control. Miss Marle's mind raced, but she kept her expression composed, her voice calm. "Okay, I'm gesturing. It's important, Simon, that you tell the truth now. It will be the first step towards understanding what happened, and in time, healing as." Simon wept. Miss Marple stood still, her thoughts already forming a clearer picture of the tragedy that had befallen the Mayfield. Family's dark secrets that had festered in the shadows were now brought into the light, and with it, the terrible weight of guilt that would follow Simon Mayfield for the rest of his life. Chapter 7. The Unraveling, the soft murmur of the wind through the trees outside was the only sound that broke the stillness of the Mayfield household. The air seemed thick with the weight of Simon's confession. As if the very room had closed in on itself, Miss Marple sat across from Simon Mayfield, her gaze steady and unflinching, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Simon, a boy not yet fully grown into himself, sat hunched forward, his hands clasped tightly together, as if trying to hold on to some semblance of control. It was a scene Miss Marple had encountered before: guilt, fear, and the subtle unraveling of a mind under the strain of a crime committed. Yet even in the midst of such a revelation, she remained calm, her years of experience in the village teaching her how to navigate emotional undercurrents of human nature. Simon's confession was not unexpected, but its details were both chilling and sorrowful. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Simon said, his voice trembling as he stared at the floor, unable to meet Miss Marple's eyes. "It all happened so fast. I never meant to kill her or Lucy." Miss Marple's expression remained unreadable, though her mind was working quickly, processing the words as they came. She had heard confessions before, and she knew that the truth often emerged, piece by piece, like a puzzle gradually coming together. "Tell me, Simon," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of understanding. "Why did you kill Anne?" Simon's chest heaved as he struggled to find the words. "I loved her," he said, almost choking on the words. "I loved her so much, Miss Marple, but she never saw a method. Way she was always so kind, so gentle, but she never looked at me the way I wanted her to. I tried to show her, tried to make her see how much I cared, but she didn't. She didn't feel the same." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving Simon. "And when she rejected you," she asked, her voice steady, "what happened then?" Simon's eyes filled with shame, and he looked away. "I couldn't take it. She didn't deserve to be with someone like me." And I thought if I could just make her say yes, and if I could make her feel what I felt then, maybe she wouldn't understand. I lost control when I was with her. I hurt her. I broke her arms, and then his voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands, as though trying to block out the horror of what he had just confessed. Miss Marple sat in silence, her mind carefully piecing together the fragments of Simon's story. Had suspected, of course, that Anne's death had been the result of something deeply personal, but now the full weight of Simon's jealousy and desperation was clear. But there was more. There was another layer to this tragedy. "You killed her," Miss Marple said, her voice softer now because of your love for her but one. "Lucy saw what you had done. You felt you had no choice but to silence her, didn't you?" Simon nodded miserably, his voice barely audible. "She saw everything. She came into the room when I was hurting, and I didn't want her to tell anyone. I thought she would go straight to Mother and Father, and then everything would be ruined. She kept saying she would, that she would tell them what I had done." He looked up, and Miss Marple, his eyes wild with fear. He couldn't let her do that. I had to stop her. Miss Marple leaned forwards, slight liar expression, still calm, but now tinged with a deep sadness. So you killed Lucitu out of fear. You couldn't bear the thought of anyone else knowing the truth. Simon nodded, his voice breaking as the weight of his actions settled upon him. I didn't mean to kill her. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just wanted everything to stop. I wanted Anne to love him, and when she didn't, He choked on his words, his face contorting with guilt and despair. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Miss Marple, I never wanted to hurt them, Miss Marple. Took a deep breath, her mind now fully understanding the complexities of Simon's actions. This was not the work of a cold-blooded killer, but rather the tragic outcome of a young man overwhelmed by his emotions, his feelings of rejection and jealousy, spiraling into uncontrollable violence. He had not planned to kill either Anne or Lucy. His actions had been driven by impulse, by the fear of losing everything, had never truly had Simon. Miss Marple said gently, her voice filled with quiet compassion. What you did was terrible, but it was not premeditated. Yao acted out of fear and desperation. But the truth has come out now, and it's important that you face the consequence of your actions. Simon looked up at her, his face a mask of anguish. What will happen to me? He whispered, his voice barely a sound. Miss Marple gave him a look that was both kind and resolute. What happens next is not for me to decide, Simon, but you must face the truth. Only then can you begin to atone for what you have done. There was a long silence, and for the first time since Miss Marple had entered the room, Simon seemed to calm, as though some weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He nodded, slowly, as if finally understanding that his path, no matter how difficult, would now be shaped by the truth. Miss Marple stood, her eyes soft but firm. The road ahead will be difficult, Simon, but I believe you will find a way to make things right. It begins with the truth. As she left the room, her heart heaved with the knowledge of the pain that Simon's confession had unleashed. Miss Marple allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The tragedy of Anne and Lucy was over, but the aftermath would ripple through the village for years to come. Yet, in her quiet way, Miss Marple had helped to unravel the mystery, one that had been concealed by fear, love, and jealousy. Now, with the truth revealed, it was time for Steve Davids to heal. Chapter 8. Justices served the small village of St. David's had begun to stir once again, though its usual tranquility was laced with an unspoken heaviness. The tragedy of Anne Summers and Lucy Mayfield had cast a long shadow over the tight-knit community, but with Simon Mayfield's confession, there was a sense that the wheels of justice had finally begun to turn. The young man had admitted his guilt, and though his remorse was palpable, there was no escaping the horror of his actions. Miss Marple, as always, had seen through the layers of grief, fear, and confusion to uncover the truth, and she stood in the center of the storm, calm, collected, and resolute. It was a skill she had honed over years of quiet observation, a quiet power that had earned her the respect of the local constabulary Inspector Godfrey, who had accompanied Miss Marple to the Mayfield household to hear Simon's confession, stood beside her now in the Villa Square. His face was ashen, the burden of the case evident in his eyes. See Tornetto, Miss Marple, his tone still tinged with disbelief. I still can't believe it, he said, shaking it head slowly. He was always so quiet and reserved, hardly ever spoke, never caused any trouble. How could someone like him? He broke off, struggling to find right words. Miss Marple gave him a small, knowing smile. Appearances can be deceiving, Inspector, she replied, her voice calm but with a hint of warmth. The quiet ones often carried the heaviest burdens. Godfrey looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. She was not merely the kindly old lady of St. Mary Mead. She was a keen observer of of human nature, someone whose understanding of the human condition went far beyond the surface. Kia, it was a quality that had enabled her to unravel this case when others might have been left grasping at straws. "You're quite right," he said, quietly nodding. "I suppose I let my own assumptions cloud my judgment. But you, Miss Marple, you saw it all, didn't you? The signs, the motivations, it was all there, wasn't it, Miss?" Marple's smile remained. Gentle eyes simply paid attention to what was in front of me, Inspector. Simon Mayfield's guilt was plain enough to see, but the reasons behind it were more complex. He didn't set out to kill anyone. The combination of jealousy, fear, and an overwhelming desire for control led him to make choices that spiraled out of his control. The inspector stood in silence for a moment, clearly contemplating her words. He had been a man of logic and reason, but Miss Marple's understanding of human emotions was a revelation to him. It wasn't just about the facts, it was about understanding the person behind the crime. "The village can begin to heal now," Godfrey said after a long pause, "though I suppose it will take some time, and Lucy were well loved. Anne Simmons' actions have shaken everyone too." The core Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her eyes drifting to the quiet streets of St. David's. "Yes, the shadow of their deaths will linger for some time, but with the truth now known, perhaps the healing can be guidance." She spoke. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves in the trees, and the church bells rang softly in the distance. It was a peaceful sound, one that would soon drown out the memories of the horrors that had unfolded here, but for Miss Marple there was always something more beneath the surface, another layer to uncover, another mystery to solve. The two of them turned towards the village's small cafe, the one where the locals often gathered for a cup of tea and a chat. The inspector seemed to sense it. Miss Marple had reached the end of her thoughts on the matter. "Miss Marple, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done," Godfrey said earnestly. "Your insight, your sharp eye for detail into something I'll never forget." "Oh, not at all, Inspector," she replied with a modest shrug. "I merely followed the trail where it led. Justice has been served, and that is all that matters." The inspector gave a smile, appreciative smile. "You make it sound so simple, but I know it was far from easy. I suspect you'll be the one who was able to sleep soundly tonight, while the rest of us will be left pondering the deeper mysteries of life." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling. "There's always more to learn, Inspector, always more to uncover." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the familiar surroundings offering her a sense of peace. After the storms, sat down in her favorite armchair, the one by the window, and stared out at the village that was now slowly returning to its normal rhythm. The case was closed. Simon Mayfield's confession had been made, and the village could begin the long, slow process of healing. She sighed contentedly, her thoughts turning to the comforting prospect of tea. "I do believe I'll have a spot of tea," Miss Marple said to herself, settling back in her chair as she poured herself a delicate cup. The sunlight filtered through the window, casting a soft glow on the room, and she closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the quiet peace that had finally returned to St. David's. "But there's always more to learn, isn't there?" she mused aloud, her voice soft and reflective. The world was full of mysteries, and though this particular one had been solved, Miss Marple knew that the next challenge was never far away, and so, with a small smile, she lifted her cup, ready for whatever the future would